I never thought my life would turn out this way. My name is Michael, and I live in an ordinary suburb with my wife Julia and 2 children, Sam and Lily. Our lives have always been stable, almost predictable morning routines. Breakfast, school, work, evening conversations. Our love was simple, unobtrusive, but real. However, something had recently started to change. Julia became a little colder, stayed late at work more often, and her phone almost never left her hand. She laughed at jokes, but not as sincerely as before. When I asked her if she was okay, she always answered briefly, "Yes, it's just that work is exhausting." But what happened a few days ago changed everything. That night I woke up in the middle of the night, for no particular reason. The room was quiet, only her phone, left on the nightstand, was shining a soft light on the ceiling. I was confused. Message that appeared on the screen. "Looking forward to seeing you again. The sender is Tom." I tried to stay calm. Maybe it's one of her colleagues, I thought. But the fire of doubt was already burning inside me. I carefully picked up the phone to see more. When I opened the messages, I found hundreds of correspondences, photos that left no doubt. My Julia was close to him. And the worst part was that Tom was my brother. That night, I lay in bed next to her, hearing her steady breathing, and felt something inside me break. There was only one question in my mind. Why? But I didn't wake her up. It's not time yet. I had to think it over first. The next morning, I watched Julia prepare breakfast for the children, laughing at their jokes as if nothing had happened. Her hands that had once held me now seemed alien. But instead of revealing my cards, I decided to hold on. I smiled, maintained the usual rhythm of our life, and at the same time started planning. I didn't want to just find out the truth. I wanted her to realize that she had betrayed not only me, but also our memories, our family. But worst of all, she chose my own brother as a traitor. This story was just beginning, and I already knew that it would be a journey I would never forget. In the days that followed, I began to keep a close eye on Julia, although I tried not to let on that something was wrong. She didn't seem to notice anything suspicious. I behaved as I would. Before, I asked her about her day, listened to the children's stories, even suggested watching a movie together. But a storm was raging inside me. Now her every move was suspicious. When she left her phone on the table, I could see her fingers reaching for it even while she was talking. She nervously clutched it in her hand, as if it were the only pass to some secret of hers. One evening, while she was washing dishes in the kitchen, I picked up her phone. It was a risky move, but I knew I had to take the chance. There were remnants of their correspondence in the device's memory. She had deleted most of the messages, but there were several calls to Tom in the call history. My brother. My blood brother. My heart hurt so badly that I almost threw the phone on the floor. But I restrained myself. I needed a plan, and I needed proof. The same night, when everyone was already asleep, I entered the question into a search engine. How to install a hidden tracker on my phone? Installing the app turned out to be easier than I thought. The next morning, while Julia was taking a shower, I quickly installed. Programmed to her device. Now, every message and call she makes will be saved and forwarded to me. After that, I began to unravel the tangle. Her evening meetings with friends, sudden trips to shopping, and worst of all, her refusals to spend time together. The more information I gathered, the more I realized that this was not a mistake, not a moment of weakness. It was a betrayal that she continued as if nothing had happened. One day I decided to act. I called Tom. He answered with a slight laugh in his voice, as if he didn't suspect anything. "Mike, brother. How are you?" His voice sounded so easy, so familiar. "It's okay, I wanted to invite you for a beer," I said in an even tone, although inside I could feel my fists clenching. "Of course, let's do it. Tell me when." We agreed to meet that evening. I didn't know if I could look him in the eye, but I had to play this role to prepare the finale. It was a game of patience. A game in which I had already decided that I would not let their lies go unpunished. That night I sat at a table in our favorite pub and watched Tom walk in. His big smile looked so familiar that for a moment I almost forgot everything I knew. He looked as relaxed as ever, with a lightness in his step as if the world belonged to him. "Mike, man, what's your life like?" he said, sitting down across from me. I forced a smile. "But everything is the same. Work, kids." "And you?" Tom told me about his new job, some funny stories, and I listened attentively. But indignation was building up inside me every minute. His ease, as if nothing had happened, fueled my desire to tear off this mask. When we had a beer, I decided to throw the first stone. "Listen, you haven't been coming to visit much lately. Julia even asked what's wrong with you." His eyes lingered on mine for a moment, but then he quickly moved the conversation to something else. "Yes, I'm all over the place, you know how it is. Work, customers." I nodded, even though I already knew he was lying. I didn't say anything more that night, but it was part of my plan. I wanted him to feel safe while I searched for a weakness in their conspiracy. The next day I decided to look at Julia with different eyes. I wanted to see all the signs that I might have missed before. And so they began to appear: the way she put her phone down, how long it took her to get ready to go out with her friends, and how she came home with a glow in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. I remembered how, in our best days, we could laugh until we cried, hug for no reason, and how she looked at me. Now all that was gone. I watched her talking to the children and realized that her heart was already far away. That evening, I was looking at the data from the app installed on her phone. All of their conversations, all those words that were supposed to be addressed to me now belonged to Tom. They talked about meeting next week. I had a plan. I booked movie tickets as if I had just decided to organize a night out for the two of us. When I told Julia about it, she almost immediately found an excuse to cancel. "Oh, Michael, I'm sorry, I've already made arrangements with Maria for that evening. We've been wanting to meet for a long time." Maria. I wonder if she realizes that she has become a screen for their meetings. "It's okay, I'll just go by myself," I replied, smiling, and added, "I hope you have a good time." She nodded, not even realizing that I would be watching her every move that evening. This game was just beginning, and I was ready to play it to the end. Julia left the house that evening with the same usual ease with which she had been going out with her friends lately. She looked flawless in neat dress, light makeup, and a smile she never gave me again. "Don't expect me early," she threw over her shoulder, closing the door behind her. I waited until her car disappeared around the corner, and immediately followed. Everything had been thought out. The GPS tracker installed on her phone led me to a small restaurant on the other side of town. Stopping in the shade nearby, I watched. Julia got out of the car, looked around as if she was afraid someone would see her, and quickly headed for the entrance. A few minutes later, Tom came out of the restaurant. He had the same arrogant smugness I had seen in the pub. They exchanged a glance and then disappeared inside. I was sitting in the car, gripping the steering wheel so hard that my fingers turned white. At first I wanted to barge in, to expose them in front of everyone. But no. It would have been too easy, too straightforward. My revenge had to be cold, calculated, and unmistakable. They both deserved to feel what I felt. I took out my phone and took a few pictures of them entering the restaurant. Then I took a few more as they sat at a table by the window, leaning into each other. Their gestures, their smiles, even their looks, everything gave them away. When I returned home, I sat in the kitchen, thinking about what to do. A simple confrontation would not work. I knew Julia, and I knew that she would find a way to work things out. Deny it, twist the situation in their favor. No, my goal is to make their lives fall apart in front of the eyes of everyone they tried to deceive. I started working on a plan. First, I recovered all their messages using software that saved all the data from her phone. I had full access to every "I love you," every promise, every detail of their secret meetings. Then I gathered information about her upcoming schedule, where she was going to be, who was going to be there. Then there's Tom. He had no idea that his own brother had already begun to expose his life. I started following him, carefully and slowly. His every trip, his every step, everything was carefully recorded. My revenge had to be as devastating as their betrayal. At some point, I realized that public exposure alone would not be enough. They had to realize how easy it is to lose everything they take for granted. And to do that, I had to hit their weakest point. Julia was afraid of looking like a hypocrite in the eyes of her friends and children. Tom valued his reputation in the company where he was building his career. All these levers were in my hands. The only thing left to do was to choose the perfect moment. The days after that night turned into a game of chess. Every move I made, every word I said, was a well-thought-out strategy to prepare the ground for the final blow. I acted as if nothing had happened, as if I knew nothing. Even when Julia came home late, I would ask her how her evening was, listening to her in advance. Prepared stories. But behind this mask, I was working on a plan to make their betrayal explicit. To begin with, I prepared a file all the messages, photos, videos, and recordings of their meetings. I divided it into several parts. One for friends and family, so they could see who Julia really is. The other was for Tom's management, where he has been diligently building his career. But I saved the biggest part for the finale. I planned to make it so that they both find themselves in the center of their own storm. I took advantage of their overconfidence. They thought I didn't suspect anything, so they didn't even try to hide any better. The next time Julia said she was going to a girls' night out, I decided to act. I called Tom as if to have a normal friendly conversation. "Hey bro, you want to come over for dinner this weekend? Julia is planning something special." He hesitated for a moment, but agreed. As expected. It was my trap. That day I prepared the house. I installed cameras in the right places, hiding them so that they would never notice them. I even made sure the children stayed overnight at my parents' place. It was supposed to be a quiet, cozy place for two traitors who would finally face all the consequences of their actions. When Julia returned that evening, her eyes were a little strained, but she quickly pulled herself together. "How was your evening?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Not bad," she replied, avoiding my eyes. "Listen, I invited Tom over for dinner on Saturday. I thought it's been a while since we've spent time together as a family," I said, watching her face change. She tried to remain calm, but I saw her fingers tense on the handle of her bag. "Oh, great," she said, smiling, though her voice was trembling a bit. Saturday came faster than I expected. Julia was restless, but she held on. Tom arrived on time, with his usual smile. They exchanged a few glances, but I pretended not to notice. "Sit down, let's drink to our family," I said, raising my glass. They were smiling, pretending that everything was fine, but I already knew that their calmness would not last long. My time has come. We were sitting at the table, and the atmosphere in the room was almost unreal. Tom was joking, Julia was laughing. It looked almost perfect, like those happy days that now seemed like a dream. But I could see right through them. Their every gesture, their every word betrayed the nervousness hidden behind their masks. "Tom, do you remember when we were kids?" I smiled, as if remembering something warm. "How you were always trying to beat me at chess?" He laughed, taking a sip of his wine. "Oh, of course. You've always been a great strategist." This word, strategist, struck me like a knife. Strategy. It was now working in my head. "Well, yes, but you were always closer to victory than I wanted to admit. You always managed to find a way to surprise me." His smile faded a little. Julia's eyes flickered in my direction for a moment. She looked like she was trying to gauge whether I knew something. The psychological technique of breaking the silence has begun to work. People do not like to of uncertainty. And now I was diligently building a wall of uncertainty around them. "You know, Tom." I leaned in a little closer, making my voice softer, almost confidential. "I've always envied your ability to keep everything under control." He coughed as if he had swallowed too much. "What do you mean?" "Well, you know." I paused, letting the silence fill the room. You have this natural ability, not to show weakness. His hand trembled slightly as he set the glass on the table. Julia started to speak to change the subject. Michael, did you say that the kids want to see your parents this week? She intervened whenever the situation became tense. But this only confirmed my suspicions. Her tone, her haste, all said that they both felt the news tightening. Yes, I answered, looking at her long and hard. You know, sometimes I wonder how much they see. I think children feel more than we think. This technique, the guilt mirror, was particularly effective. It forced them to think about what they were hiding. Julia looked down. Tom refilled his glass. The atmosphere at the table grew thicker, like the fog before a storm. You know, I stood up, picking up my glass. I think it's time to bring some clarity to this evening. They both froze. In their eyes I saw the fear I had been seeking. They didn't know what I was going to say. Uncertainty is my main ally. I took a sip of wine, put the glass down and said calmly, "Let's play a little honesty." Their eyes met, and at that moment I realized that they were already betraying themselves. My words hung in the air like a burden that could not be ignored. Tom and Julia were silent, exchanging quick, intense glances. This was the one. The reaction I expected. The uncertainty began to act as a poison that eats away at their confidence. "What do you mean, Mike?" Julia finally asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. I smiled, not warmly, but the way a predator smiles when it knows its prey is trapped. "Well, let's just say that I've had a lot of time to think in the last few weeks. And you know, it's interesting how much honesty can change our lives." I walked around the table, standing behind them, and felt the tension between them grow. My silence again acted like a lever, making them wait, wondering what I would say next. "For example, Tom, you've always been a master of deception, haven't you? Even as a kid. Remember that game where you used to hide my stuff and then pretend to help me find it?" Tom cleared his throat and looked away. "It was just childish jokes." "Maybe." I nodded, came closer and leaned on the back of his chair. "But some things stay with us forever, don't they?" I turned to Julia. Her hands were clutching the edge of the table so hard that her fingers were white. "And you, Julia, have always been so honest, or so it seemed. But you know, people change sometimes. Don't you agree?" She didn't answer, just nodded silently, her eyes never leaving mine. It was time to make my next move. I took out my phone and opened one of the photos I had taken that night at the restaurant. "You see, I recently decided to play a game too. A game of observation. And you know what? It turned out to be very informative." I put the phone on the table, turning the screen toward them. It was a photo of Tom and Julia sitting at a table in a restaurant, leaning into each other. Their faces changed at the same time. "Mike, it's not what you think," Tom began, but his voice sounded weak, without confidence. "Oh, really?" I interrupted him, raising my eyebrows. "Then please explain. I'm all ears." Julia tried to say something, but I raised my hand to stop her. "No, Julia, let's not make excuses. You both knew exactly what you were doing. You both lied to me, to the kids, to everyone." Tom jumped to his feet, but I stood closer and pressed on his shoulder, forcing him to sit back down. "Sit down, Tom. The game is just beginning." Their faces turned pale, but it was only the first wave. I was going to make sure that they not only felt this shame, but also lived with it long after that evening. "I have a present for both of you. You like surprises, don't you?" They didn't answer. Their silence was music to me. I took the envelope out of my pocket and put it on the table. "All your messages are here. Photos. Videos. Evidence. And tomorrow, if you don't do what I say, everyone you know will have it, your friends, your work, even our children's school." Julia covered her face with her hands, and Tom looked as if he had just lost his whole world. "What do you want?" he whispered, and it was a sweet question. "Only one. Expect it tomorrow. In the meantime, enjoy your evening. It is your last as partners in this sin." After dinner, the tension remained in the air even as Tom and Julia, tense and silent, finally left. My game was only at the beginning. I went back to the living room, pulled out my phone, and looked at the same photos I had shown them at the table. The feeling of satisfaction at their frightened faces briefly strengthened my resolve. But that was not enough. My goal wasn't just to expose them, I wanted them to feel betrayed, humiliated, confused. I wanted their own emotions to destroy them. That evening I started preparing the last stage of the plan. The next morning, I pretended nothing had happened. The usual routine, getting the kids ready for school, coffee, a few familiar phrases with Julia. Her eyes were darting around like a cornered animal, but she held on. I, in turn, pretended not to notice. At work, I wrote an anonymous letter to Tom's office. In it, I described in detail his affair with Julia, including the places they met, and details that could not be made up. All the evidence was attached: photographs, phone records, even screenshots of correspondence. Later, I sent a similar package to Julia's closest friends and acquaintances, her friends, our social circle, even her parents. I didn't identify myself as the sender so that it would look like I was just a random whistleblower who decided to help. A few days later, the situation began to escalate. Tom didn't show up for work. I got the news through friends. His sordid history was being discussed by his colleagues, and he obviously realized that his career was in jeopardy. Julia, on the other hand, behaved like a ghost. She spent more and more time at home, looking exhausted and frightened. But I didn't say anything. I just watched her try to stay afloat, even when the water started to pull her in. "Are you okay?" I asked one evening, stirring my tea as if with concern. She didn't answer. She just looked at me briefly, as if I were a stranger who knew more than he should. "If something is wrong, you can tell me," I added, smiling as if I didn't suspect anything. Her voice broke. "Michael, do you know something?" "Me?" I raised my eyebrows. Why should I know anything? It was a wonderful feeling. I made her doubt my every word, my every gesture. Julia no longer trusted even the usual routine of our life. But that was only part of the game. The next step was to finally destroy their little world. A few days after my plan began, their panic became apparent. Tom tried to contact me by phone. His voice messages were full of nervous tone. "Michael, listen. I need to talk to you. It's serious." I didn't answer. Let him suffer. Julia, for her part, made several pathetic attempts to establish contact, acting as if nothing had happened. She was cooking dinner, trying to. She started initiating conversations, even suggested going to the movies, something she hadn't done in years. But I remained cold, pretending not to suspect anything. The next stage required a more precise strike. I decided to play on their fears even more. I sent an anonymous message to Julia using a newly created account. "We know what you did. Get ready for the truth to come out soon." I imagined her reading those words, her heart sinking. Her reaction was not long in coming. That evening, she paced nervously around the kitchen, silently looking at her phone, her fingers trembling. "Is everything okay?" I asked again, watching her struggle with HERSELF. "Yes," she lied, but her voice was no longer convincing. To increase the effect, I sent a similar message to Tom. Now they were both on edge, looking around paranoidly. They couldn't know who did it, and that was my main weapon. The culmination of my plan was their personal collapse. It was time for them to face each other. I arranged for them to meet at the hotel where they usually held their meetings. I left a message from an anonymous source that seemed to reach them both by accident. "We need to talk. Come to room 312 at 8 o'clock. It was a trap, and they both came. I watched everything through the cameras I had installed in the room in advance. There where they met, exchanged short, nervous phrases, but quickly realized that they were trapped. Then I played a voice message that I had prepared in advance. "Hi, Julia." "Hello, Tom. Welcome to your little room of lies." They both froze. I watched their faces change from surprise to shock to fear. Did you think it would remain a secret? No, this is just the beginning. I had no intention of personally interfering. They had to deal with the consequences of their actions themselves. But this was not the end. After they left the hotel room, their world began to crumble with each passing hour. Julia returned home, looking as confused as a ghost. She started making foolish attempts to reconnect with me. She cooked my favorite dinner, asked me about my day, even suggested we plan a trip together. I answered with short, indifferent sentences as if nothing had happened, but in my heart I enjoyed her fuss. Tom, on the other hand, hadn't shown up for work in days. News of his affair was spreading through the office like wildfire. I knew that his reputation was already under threat, and this is just the beginning. I decided to go further. I had one last trump card left, the recording from the hotel room cameras. It was their last dialogue, their confession of how long they had been. I edited a short video and sent it anonymously to Julia. The next day I heard her crying coming from the bathroom. She tried to be quiet, but I heard everything. When she came out, her face was crying, but she tried to keep her face on. Michael, I have to tell you something. I looked up from the newspaper, pretending to be surprised. Did something happen? She took a step forward, but then stopped. Her hands were shaking. No, nothing. Her fear and uncertainty were better than any confession. Meanwhile, I used another way to destroy their little world. I sent the edited video to Tom's boss, accompanied by a signature. You might find this interesting. Your employee is not using working time as intended. I knew that his boss had a reputation for being a tough boss who did not tolerate scandals. Tom couldn't afford to lose his job, he had no other options. Julia stopped coming to meetings with her friends. She was afraid to look people in the eye, knowing that some of them might have already received letters with evidence of her betrayal. Her phone rang less and less often. Her friends gradually became distant, and invitations to parties stopped altogether. One evening when I came home, she was sitting in the kitchen. There was a half-empty bottle of wine in front of her, and her eyes were red with tears. "Why don't you say anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. I paused before answering, looking her straight in the eye. Because I have nothing else to say. It was honest. Her own actions had already said it all. My revenge was almost complete. But I knew the real ending was yet to come. I was preparing something bigger, something they would both remember forever. The next few days were the calm before the storm. Julia no longer tried to pretend that everything was normal. Her silence was louder than any words. Tom also dropped out of my life. He avoided me, didn't try to make excuses, and even stopped answering our mother's calls, which had always been sacred to him. I decided that it was time to deliver the final blow that would destroy them completely. It was an ordinary Friday night. I asked Julia to prepare dinner for the two of us. She agreed without further ado, probably thinking that I wanted to try to save our marriage. But I had other plans. Before I sat down at the table, I called Tom with a message. "Come, we need to talk. It's important." 7:30 at our house. I knew he would come. His curiosity and fear overwhelmed his common sense. At 8 in the evening, we were already sitting at the table when the doorbell rang. Julia jumped up, surprised. "I'll get it," I said calmly, getting up. When I returned with Tom, her face was as white as paper. He looked equally tense, his eyes frantically searching for an explanation. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the table. They both sat down slowly, like two criminals on trial. The atmosphere in the room was heavy as lead. "So," I began, keeping calm even though a storm was raging inside me, "we are all here. It's time to talk about the truth." Julia opened her mouth, but I stopped her. "No need for excuses, Julia. I know everything. I know about both of you, every meeting you've had, every word you've said behind my back." Their eyes went wide. Tom clenched his fists, trying to look confident, but I could see his face go pale. I pulled out my laptop and turned on the video recorded in that very hotel room. Their confessions, their plans, even their laughter at my naivety. I turned up the volume so that every word would sink into their minds. "What do you want?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I leaned closer to her. "Nothing. You've already lost everything." I got up and walked to the door, leaving them with their shame, with their own lies. That evening I left the house. I decided not to participate in their theater anymore. I had already won. Now it is their turn to face the reality they have created. After that night, my life changed forever. I left the house with only a few suitcases with the essentials. My children stayed with me. I could not leave them in this poisoned atmosphere. Julia did not even try to protest. She knew that she no longer had the right to demand anything. Tom also disappeared from our lives. He lost his job after his adventures became public, and later I heard that he had moved to another city. Perhaps it was his attempt to escape from the consequences of his actions, but I knew that you cannot escape from yourself. It was strange at first. An empty apartment, the absence of familiar sounds from home, the I was used to. The silence of the nights frightened me with its emptiness. But then I began to find freedom in it. I no longer felt the weight of the lies that had surrounded me for months. The children also gradually began to adapt. I talked to them a lot, explained everything in a way that they could understand without going into too much detail. They could see the pain in my eyes, but I promised them that everything would be fine. And every day I worked to fulfill that promise. As for Julia, I heard that she moved away too. Her relationship with Tom didn't stand the test of reality. No one trusts a person who has already betrayed someone else. She was left alone, destroyed by her own decisions. But I no longer followed her life. Her problems were no longer mine. A year has passed. Now I live a completely different life. My children and I have new traditions: Saturday trips to the park, board game nights. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I was living, not just existing. I have learned to let go. Not all wounds heal quickly, but I no longer let anger or pain control me. Sometimes I look at my reflection in the mirror and think about what I have become. My revenge was sweet, but it did not bring back what I lost. The only thing it gave me was a new beginning. I am no longer angry or broken. I am free.